The Vikings. I'm sure many of you are interested in the Vikings. They're one of the most fascinating groups of people in history. I'd like to look at how the Vikings were won to Christ. The Scandinavians were the last great group of Teutonic people to abandon heathenism and to embrace Christianity. The Viking marauders from pagan north wreaked havoc throughout northern and western Europe. Throughout the 9th and 10th centuries, Vikings raided, killed, and plundered. They also established strong Viking settlements in Normandy, northern France, England, Scotland, Ireland. They say that all the red hair in Ireland comes from the Vikings. Iceland, Greenland, throughout the Baltic, and in Russia. They were amazing shipbuilders. These ships had a very narrow draft. They could go in rivers, they could go very far up rivers. They were amazingly stable. They crossed the ocean. With these sail and rowing ships, very versatile, and they could go either direction. They could quickly switch to they didn't have to turn around because both sides were replicated. You could go forward or backward just as easily in a Viking ship. They used the sails wisely. They had all kinds of ways of being able to also not only tell with the stars, but they also made some of the first compasses. This is one of the Viking balancing acts. You'd have to run from oar to oar. And of course you'd get these naughty people who just pull an oar in and make the person slip deliberately, but this is one of the running from one side of the ship to the other, just jumping from oar to oar. These were the most frightening sights that people could see in those days. When the Vikings arrived, people just fled, screaming. And they got all through these routes, including down the Volga, the Dnieper, the Don rivers, the Danube, the Rhine. The Vikings could get almost anywhere, it seemed, where there was a river or coast. So the Vikings settled, as you can see here, working its way from the darkest to the lightest as to how they kept moving out. Even the word Russ, amongst where Russia comes from, is from the Vikings from Sweden who invaded Russia. And that's where the royal family lineage came from originally, was from the Vikings. The Viking warriors lived on the ships, traveled from it, and they managed to not just conquer a lot, they explored as far as North America. The Vikings got to North America 5 centuries before Columbus. They land, of course, in what today would be Newfoundland. And they fought the Indians in Canada. I'm sure the Indians were wondering what type of characters these were. Aluson wrote of the shocking Viking raid in a monastery at Lindisfarne in 793 AD. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. Nor was it thought possible that such an inroad from the sea could be made. Behold, the church of St. Cuthbert, splattered with the blood of the priests of God, despoiled of all its ornaments, a place more venerable in all of Britain, has fallen prey to pagans. Soon a new prayer was added to the church liturgy, from the fury of the Northmen, O Lord, deliver us. At the time, probably nobody could have predicted that the violent Vikings would be conquered by the Prince of Peace and become some of the most enthusiastic missionaries for the advance of the gospel. The Viking era is normally dated from the Battle of Lindisfarne, the raid of the monastery in Lindisfarne, AD 793, to the Battle of Hastings, 1066, when the Vikings finally conquered England. And you can see their roots. They settled a huge swathe of eastern and northern England, settled parts of Ireland, including what today is Dublin. Although the Vikings were famous for the hit-and-run raids, many Vikings actually settled in the British Isles and deeply influenced English culture. The fact that we have a 7-day week is due to the biblical account of God creating the world in 6 days and resting on the 7th. However, the days of the week were originally named by the Romans after the 7 main celestial planets: Sunday, Moon Day, Mars Day, Mercury Day, Jupiter Day, Venus Day, and Saturn Day, named after these 7 celestial planets: Sun, Moon, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, Saturn. understandable. However, the Anglo-Saxon Vikings replaced 4 of these with the names of Viking deities. So Tuesday is named after the Viking war god Tyr. Wednesday after the Viking war god Woden, or Odin, Woden's Day. We're today on Woden's Day. Thor's Day, named after the Viking god of war, Thor. Friday after the Viking fertility god Frigg, or Frey. And so, interesting that just the days of the week that we use, 4 of them are named after Viking deities. Extraordinary. Many English words have their roots in Scandinavian speech, including anger, die, scant, ugly, loose, wrong, low, sky, take, window, husband, happy, thrive, ill, beer, anchor, and the word berserk. The word berserk is actually the name of a Viking soldier. So when he said he went berserk, he meant he's acting like a Viking warrior in battle, swinging his battle axe and that sort of thing. Ansgar is the great missionary to the Norsemen, the apostle of the north, they call him. When the Vikings were the terror of Europe, God placed a great missionary burden on the young Ansgar. With his own money, Ansgar redeemed several Danish youths who were slaves. He educated them to be his co-workers and bring the gospel to the countrymen. So he bought some captured Vikings who had been made slaves and then trained them in the gospel so that they could help him to understand their language and take the gospel to Denmark. Harold, king of Denmark, had been driven from his throne and sought refuge at the court of Louis I, king of the Franks. While at Louis's court, King Harold heard the gospel, turned to Christ, and submitted to baptism. On the king's return to Denmark, Ansgar eagerly preached. He joined the king to preach the gospel to the Danes, and at Hedeby, Ansgar built a small wooden church, but persecution forced him to flee the country. Sweden was the next mission field for Ansgar. Ansgar responded to a request from King Bjorn of Sweden. It was early in the 9th century when the Vikings were raiding, plundering, and burning the coastal cities of northern and western Europe. Ansgar narrowly escaped with his life when Norsemen burned the churches and the monasteries in Hamburg. With 2 co-workers, Ansgar crossed the Baltic Sea to begin ministering in Sweden. On the way, their vessel was plundered by pirates and they arrived destitute in Sweden. King Bjorn, though, welcomed the Christians to Sweden and the first church was built in the country. Of course, Vikings worshipped Thor. At an assembly of the people, a question was debated as to whether the missionary should be allowed to continue to preach Christ and so invite the wrath of the old Viking gods. At a critical point in the discussions, an old Viking stood up and declared with great force that it was clear that the Christian God is stronger than Thor. This decided the matter, and the missionaries received freedom to continue to preach the gospel in Sweden. Many Christians saw the Vikings as God's judgment. More than any previous invasions and crises faced by the Christian church, the Viking raids wrought desolation throughout the Western Christendom. The Vikings laid waste to monasteries and churches and shook the churches to their foundations. A decline and a decay in faith and morals had set in long before the Viking invasions, and many saw the fury of the Norsemen as the judgment of God upon a backslidden and often apostate church. But there was resistance in Wessex. Churches and monasteries were destroyed, clergy and monks were slain, church buildings lay vacant, until in the south of England, the West Saxons. In England you've got Sussex, South Saxons, Wessex, West Saxons, Essex, East Saxons, the Saxons that settled the south parts of England. The West Saxons were rallied by King Alfred the Great to steadfastly resist and ultimately to defeat the great Danish invasion. And King Alfred the Great is the only English king known as great, and he was the one who strengthened the churches. He's the one who launched education for all, and he's the one who also is the father of the English Navy. He realized to defeat a sea people, you've got to have a strong navy. And he also realized we've got to convert our enemies. We can't just beat them in battle. In 878, after King Alfred defeated the Danish army at Ashdown, instead of putting him to death, which was pretty standard practice in those days for a defeated enemy or enslaving him, he required its king, King Guthrum, and 30 other of the leaders to be baptized as Christians. No point having a treaty with heathen, they're going to break the treaty. you've got to convert to Christ, undertake baptism and catechism for that, so that we know that we can have a peace treaty with him. In 882, another Viking leader in the lower Rhine region abandoned heathenism and embraced Christianity, receiving baptism in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. Then Duke Rollo of the Vikings and some of his followers received baptism and created the Duchy of Normandy, from which the later invasion of England took place in 1066. The Vikings were impressed by Christ. The ethics of Christianity were so radically different to traditional Viking culture that it took literally centuries for the Scandinavian people to be thoroughly evangelized and discipled. One of the chief attractions was the conviction that Christ is a mighty victor who has risen triumphant over death. The power of Christ impressed the hardened Viking warriors. In Norway, the king commanded his people, be converted to Christ or be prepared to die. However, in Denmark and Sweden, the Vikings were converted by more persuasion than force. Pioneer missionaries Willibrord and Ludiger attempted to take the gospel to the Vikings, but with little visible results. Ansgar was the great missionary to the Vikings. It remained for Ansgar, born of Saxon parents in northwest of France in 801, to succeed where the others had failed. Ansgar was described as a sensitive child who led a devout life. He experienced visions and dreams, and he possessed a combination of humility, self-forgetfulness, and of undaunted courage and energetic initiative. He won Sweden to Christ. King Harold of Denmark was baptized in 826 in Mainz. Some of the first pagans in Sweden to request baptism included the leader of Berka, an island in the Lake Malmö. You can see here Berka, not far from present-day capital of Stockholm. Despite serious reverses, violence, destruction of churches, Ansgar did not give up. He persevered, and soon Danish missionaries were being sent to establish churches in Sweden. Although in the so-called History Channel's Vikings, they have Ansgar being a failure, being put to death. No, he lived a long life. He did succeed. He won them to Christ. They saw many miracles. They saw that his God was greater than their gods, unlike Vikings, which totally turns the history of Ansgar upside down. Ansgar's faithful work was continued by his disciple Rimbert, who ministered both amongst the Danes and the Swedes, and Rimbert was succeeded by Adelgar. See, it's a mountain marathon race, a relay race where you're passing the faith once delivered to the saints to the next generation. Of course, all these missions were done amidst much opposition and persecution. Early in the 10th century, King Gorm of Denmark, a determined enemy of Christianity, attempted to banish Christianity from his realm. Many ministers and missionaries were martyred, numerous churches burned to the ground. But the Saxons championed the Christian cause. In the British Museum in London, you can see this old Saxon shield, an old Saxon helmet. You can see very advanced type of metalwork and an advanced culture amongst the Saxons. This is the front part of the Saxon shield. And the churches that were being built at this time, this is the oldest church in England. It dates back to the 6th century. And a lot of the stones come from Hadrian's Wall, from not far away. As the Saxons grew in strength, they became champions of the Christian cause. When Henry, the king of the Germans in 919, sponsored numerous missionary outreaches to the Danes, after his victory over the Danes in 934, King Henry compelled the rulers to accept Christianity. This was quite common in Europe. Defeat them in battle, force them to convert, and from that point, we're not suggesting that brings them to salvation, but it opens them up to the evangelism and discipleship, which later led to the people's coming to Christ. Uni was encouraged by the king to renew the work of the missionary Ansgar. Gorm's successor, King Harold, looked with favor upon Uni's attempts to reassemble the scattered remnants of Christian communities on the Danish Isles and to bring in ministers to rebuild these congregations. It's quite extraordinary how in the so-called History Channel's depiction of the Vikings that they're all wide open. Nobody thinks of defense. They can even be in foreign lands as invaders like England. And there's not the slightest semblance of protection, so they're regularly getting massacred one way or the other. But all of our archaeological evidence is that the Vikings had strong defensive fortifications around all their settlements, as depicted here. King Henry's son, Otto the Great, became king in 936 and 962, and he was crowned emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Under royal favour, the churches experienced a wave of reform with tremendous revival of devotion and enthusiasm. King Harold of Denmark extended his realm to become overlord of Norway, and as he himself was baptized, he encouraged the spread of Christianity throughout his realms. The gospel grew despite opposition amongst the Vikings. Harold's son Sven attempted to bring about a pagan rebellion against his father, who died in the struggle. Sven severely persecuted the Christians and repeatedly invaded England, where he died in 1014. In Sweden, a pagan king Eric arose, hostile to Christianity, yet the church continued to grow. The missionary Popper won many thousands to the faith. Odenkar, a missionary from Denmark, strengthened the gospel work in Sweden. King Canute, who is famous in English history, he was actually king of Denmark and king of England simultaneously. He sponsored missionaries. Under King Canute, the church was firmly established in Denmark, and he, as king of Denmark, later became king of all England too. Under his support, missionaries from Germany established more churches in Denmark. He commanded subjects to learn the Lord's Prayer and be faithful in communion with the Lord. The church in Denmark grew, deepened its strong ties to the Saxon churches in Germany and England. Bear in mind, the Saxons come from Saxony in Germany. Anglo-Saxons, the Angles, also came from Germany, what today would be Germany, into Denmark, and the Juts, or the Jutes, they also came from Jutland. So the original inhabitants of England, the Celts, moved off into Wales, and of course the Picts in the north, and also the Irish would have been the original Britons, Celts. But the Angles and the Saxons, they came from Germany and Denmark. And the Normans, well, of course, they came from Norway and from Normandy, which had Vikings from Norway there. So England overwhelmingly is made up of Germans and Vikings, or the descendants of them. The conversion of the Vikings in Norway was far more stormy than that of Denmark. Throughout the 10th century, Saxon missionaries from England labored throughout Denmark, establishing mission stations, congregations. From the time of King Alfred the Great, the revived churches in England evidenced a dynamic vitality in missions to the Vikings. But the Kingdom of Norway has got the most exciting story of all. The Norwegian kingdom was the creation of Harald Harfager, or Harold the Fairhaired, who died in 933. By much combat, he established himself the overruler of Norway. Vikings didn't have kings from ancestry as much as from battle. You became king by being the strongest, the best, the most skilled, the bravest. His sons Eric Bloodaxe and Hakon the Good, don't you love their names? It makes it so easy to understand where they're coming from. Struggled over the succession, and Hakon had been sent to England to study, and he had been converted to Christ in England. He had been baptized, he'd been discipled as a Christian. So by 935, the tall, young, handsome, athletic Hakon established his supremacy throughout Norway through combat. He's accepted, king of all Norway. And this began the great royal mission to win the Vikings. Hakon attempted to win his people to the Christian faith, and most of his immediate court were soon baptized. Later he sent to England for missionaries and began to build churches in Norway. After reigning 15 years, by the year 950, Hakon proposed to the assembly of landowners that they adopt Christianity. Most of the landowners responded with great hostility and vehemently refused to abandon the old pagan ways. They began to place great pressure on the king to compromise and to participate in the pagan sacrifices. Facing open rebellion, King Hakon very reluctantly ate some of the meat in the ceremonial feast organized by the landowners, sort of like meat offered to idols, so to speak. Later, after being wounded in battle on his deathbed in 961, Hakon declared his great remorse that he compromised and he had desired to do penance for his sins. A rocky road, lots of reverses. His nephew Harald Grafell succeeded the throne of Norway. While not as enthusiastic a Christian as Hakon, Harald Grafell did pull down pagan temples wherever he went, but misrule and bad seasons led to the people resenting the faith. The reason they're getting bad harvests is obviously because we've abandoned our old gods. In 970, Harald Grafell was lured to Denmark and killed. King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark, presume he did not floss, Harald Bluetooth made himself overlord of Norway and encouraged Christianity there. Olaf Tryggvason was the son of the King of Norway, born in 964. His great-grandfather, Harald Harfager, the Fairhead, initially established the Kingdom of Norway. When Olaf's father was murdered in 968, Olaf fled the country with his mother. He was an adventurous youth. He is captured by slave raiders. He is sold into slavery. But Olaf was rescued and raised in Scandinavia in a colony in Russia, Scandinavian colony in Russia. Olaf ended up in the court of Russia's Tsar Vladimir I, where he became a favorite of the Queen. When Olaf was just 12 years old, the Tsar put a dozen ships under his command and sent him off to battle at 12 years. By the time he was 21 years old, Olaf Tryggvason was renowned as the ultimate Viking. Tall, strong, handsome, unparalleled in martial skill. He led a huge army of Swedish Vikings in a fleet of almost 90 ships to loot Holland. After devastating the Dutch, he went to fight the French, and he left a massive amount of death and destruction wherever he went. His next target was England, where after the Battle of Malden, near the mouth of the Thames, he forced the Anglo-Saxon king Ethelred the Unready to pay a tribute of 10,000 pounds of silver. After this, he moved north, plundering Northumberland and Scotland. He attacked the Hebrides and the Isle of Man. He conducted raids in Northern Ireland, Wales, Cornwall, and France again. With a fleet of over 94 ships, he again attacked England, killing and looting wildly, until Ethelred the Unready offered him a further 22,000 pounds. Evidently, you couldn't buy the Vikings, you could only rent them. Off the coast of Cornwall, Olaf heard of a local fortune teller who was renowned to have the gift of prophecy. Olaf rode to the remote rocky retreat and asked the prophet if he could foresee anything in his future. "Thou wilt become a renowned king and do celebrated deeds. Many men wilt thou bring to faith and baptism, and both to thy own and others' good. And that thou not doubt this truth of this answer, listen to this." And the old man then predicted Olaf would soon suffer a mutiny from his men, in which he would be wounded. He would be carried to a ship on his oblong shield. But after 7 days he would recover, and he would be baptized as a Christian. When the mutiny happened, and the wounding and the recovery, precisely as the hermit had predicted, all happened, Olaf sought the old man again to inquire, how could you possibly possess such knowledge? The man humbly confessed, "The God of the Christians has blessed me." When King Ethelred heard of the conversion and baptism of his tormentor, King Olaf, he sent his bishop and officials to present him with royal gifts and to offer Christian fellowship. In 995, news from Norway reached Olaf that the leader, Earl Håkon, the very man who had murdered Olaf's father, had caused an uproar in the land by demanding the daughters of respected leaders of the community. And although Håkon originally accepted Christianity under threat from the German Emperor Otto, he had since reverted, backslidden, apostatized to heathenism, and he had restored many heathen temples, and he was persecuting Christians. Earl Håkon, the apostate, had gone so far as to offer his best horses and his youngest son, a 17-year-old, as sacrifices to heathen goddess. It was at this opportune time that Olaf, the great-grandson of King Harald Harfager, determined to leave England and to avenge the death of his father, the exile of his mother, the slavery of his youth, and to end the pagan misrule of Earl Håkon. With just 5 ships, Olaf landed in Norway, and he claimed it for Christ. Soon, word reached him that Earl Håkon had angered 2 landowners by attempting to seize their wives for himself. The growing resistance was greatly strengthened when word reached Olaf Tryggvason that he was on the way to claim the throne and to deal with Håkon. Olaf was renowned as the ultimate Viking warrior without parallel. His height, his strength, his athletic stature, his superior skills in all the warrior arts, his boldness, his ruthlessness were renowned throughout the land. Earl Håkon fled, hid in a pit beneath a pigsty, where he was killed by a slave. What an ignominious end. At National Assembly, Olaf was pronounced King of all Norway. He then traveled throughout the land and consolidated his rule and attempted to Christianize the people. Many of his relatives now became his first converts, and he appointed them as Christ's captains. "I shall make you great and mighty men for doing this work. All Norway must be Christian or die." The scattered settlements on the west and east shores of the Oslo Ford, readily accepted baptism. But the people in northern part of the Vik resisted the gospel. King Olaf challenged the followers of Thor and Odin to mortal combat, and by the end of the year, he had convinced everyone that Christ is greater than Thor and Odin. As King Olaf moved to the western northern fords of Norway, he challenged the heathen to swimming races. Of course, he's swimming in icy waters. Archery contests, mortal combat, and he won every time. His message was to the point: repent or die. Those that choose to fight were quickly defeated by Olaf's superior strength and skill. King Olaf declared the heathen gods are demons. The power behind the idols are evil spirits, and all the sorcerers and those who promote idolatry and heathenism are to be banished from his kingdom. Those wizards and priests who resisted were killed, and some incorrigibles he marooned on a rock far offshore at low tide, which meant by the time the tide changes, you're drowned. At Trondheim, which had been the stronghold of the late heathen king Earl Hakon, Olaf burned the heathen temples, destroyed their idols. The local chiefs rose in rebellion against him, and Olaf mustered a large army. With 30 ships anchored in the river Nid, Olaf invited the local priests and chiefs to a feast, where he indicated he'd be willing to perform a heathen sacrifice. When the chiefs were gathered together, Olaf declared, "If I am to return to making heathen sacrifices, then I will make the greatest sacrifice of all. I will not sacrifice slaves, but men. I will sacrifice the greatest of men only." He then named the most prominent leaders of the opposition as his chosen sacrifices. As the horrified heathen howled in protest, Olaf gave them a straight chance: baptism or battle. He held 11 leaders hostage until every one of their people were baptized. At nearby Trondheim, the local chief Ironbeard demanded that the king offer sacrifices as other kings before him had done. Olaf said he would do so. He walked into the temple and smashed the idol of Thor to pieces with his axe. He then killed Ironbeard, persuaded the local village to abandon their heathen ways and be baptized as Christians. Further north, Olaf faced the strong opposition of Chief Raud the Strong. Raud mobilized his army, and a fierce sea battle was fought, and Olaf's forces overwhelmed Raud's rebels. Raud escaped to a refuge on an island hideout in Saltenford. The ford was turbulent, and for a week no ship could enter. And as Raud attempted to mobilize his witchcraft against the king, Olaf summoned his bishops to read the Gospels and to pray. By some miracle, his ships managed to negotiate the treacherous and turbulent ford, the entrance to the ford. So soon Raud was apprehended and brought before the king, who ordered him to submit to Christ. "I will not take your property from you, but instead will be your friend, if you make yourself worthy to be so." When Raud rejected this offer with vile blasphemies, Olaf had his men force a snake and add it down his throat. That was the last resistance to Olaf's crusade to eradicate paganism in Norway. Now he focused on winning Iceland to Christ. But before he could do so, in the year 1000, King Olaf was killed in the spectacular sea battle of Svold. The pagan queen Sigrid the Haughty was furious that Olaf had spurned her advances. She mobilized 2 pagan kings to trap Olaf off the coast of Denmark, and Olaf died courageously as he had lived, rejoicing that he had succeeded in his mission to convince the Vikings of Norway to abandon heathenism, to destroy their idols, to commit to following the Christian faith. Another prominent Norwegian king who consolidated the Christian faith was Olaf Haraldsson. In 1007, when he was just 12 years old, Olaf Haraldsson was sent out as a sea king to raid Sweden. Later in Denmark, Olaf joined forces with Thorkel the Tall. Together they launched raids on Jutland, Frisia, Holland, and England. They tormented poor King Ethelred the Unready, who had already suffered so much at the hands of the earlier Olaf Tryggvason. In 1009, Olaf and Thorkel attacked London and East Anglia. They martyred the Archbishop of Canterbury. They plundered his cathedral. They raided Brittany, France, and Spain. They burned Oxford. Then Olaf had a traumatic spiritual experience, and he saw a terrifying vision of Christ. Olaf abandoned his heathen ways. He committed to being a Christian. In 1015, he arrived in Norway and proclaimed himself king. And he immediately proclaimed the Christian faith throughout Norway, and he built numerous churches, including these magnificent wooden churches that today so epitomize Norway. Olaf became known as the great lawgiver. With Bishop Grimkel, he established the Moster Law, not the Monster Law, the Moster Law. While most of Norway accepted this, Frontline continued with the pagan practices and incurred the wrath of King Olaf, who descended on the area, fining or executing the offenders. At Gulbrandstad, local pagans confronted him with a huge wooden idol of Thor. Olaf distracted him by calling the attention to the bright sunshine behind him as a herald of his god. And as his enemies turned to face the sunrise, one of Olaf's warriors smashed the idol of Thor and revealed that its wood was rotten. And as gold spilled out and large rats, which had obviously been living off the food offerings put down the mouth of this idol, they scattered. King Olaf pointed out that the gold they had wasted in offering to Thor's rotten idol would look far better on their wives and their daughters. This demonstration of Christ's superiority over Thor convinced the locals to be baptized. And as a contemporary report noted, they who met as enemies now parted as friends. For 12 years, King Olaf ruled Norway and brought Iceland and the Faroe Islands to Christianity. Most unpopularly of all, he outlawed the Viking raids, which had been considered an essential way of life. I mean, why would you destroy it? This is how we're getting so much of our goods, but he said we've got to love our neighbor. It was at this point that Denmark attempted to regain control over the previous colony of Norway, and Olaf was forced to flee. In 1030, Olaf attempted to liberate his country from the Danes, and at the Battle of Stiklestad, heavily outnumbered, more than 3-1, Olaf inspired his men with a battle cry, Fram, Fram, Christsman, Krausman, Koningsman. On, Christ's men, crossmen, king's men. Olaf and his men fought boldly, bravely, but they were overwhelmed by superior numbers. The Vikings grew to regret the betrayal of King Olaf as Danish taxes and oppression intensified. So within a year, Olaf was popularly proclaimed a saint. His remains enshrined in Saint Clement, and what he had failed to do in his life, he now succeeded in death to unite and inspire his people to win their country's freedom and independence from Denmark, to be united as an independent Christian kingdom. The Cathedral in York was dedicated to St. Olaf. Olaf was regarded by many medieval rulers as an example of the ideal ruler. A church in Constantinople was dedicated to the memory of King Olaf, and the sword he had wielded at the Battle of Stiklestad is hung over the high altar. Olaf is the last Western saint to be accepted by the Eastern Orthodox Church before the Great Schism. And the Vikings surrendered to Christ. By a combination of pioneer missionary work, royal favor, and combat, the ferocious Vikings were convinced to abandon heathenism, destroy their idols, abandon their aggression, cease the violent raids, submit to baptism, and commit to following the Christian faith. The Vikings came to be convinced that the Christian God is more powerful than all other gods. They saw how he answered prayer. They witnessed miracles, phenomenal victories. They saw how Christian kings and missionaries were able to destroy idols and defy the heathen gods and their taboos without suffering any ill effects. They saw their pagan gods were powerless before the all-powerful Jesus Christ. Christ was honored and worshipped as the mighty victor, who had triumphed over all the powers of death, hell, Satan, and the grave. He is the risen, ascended Christ, King of kings and Lord of lords, with all other authorities in subjection to him. This cross is on Lindisfarne, where the Vikings once began their raid. Yes, all kings shall fall down before Christ, and all nations shall serve him. So Scandinavia has been won for Christ. And you can see today many magnificent churches built by the Vikings. This in Denmark. This in Sweden. Here you can see the Danish flag has the cross on it. The Finnish flag has a cross on it. In fact, every Viking flag now has a cross prominent on it. Iceland, Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark. And there's the Danish flag, the white cross and red. The Norwegian flag, the blue cross with a white background with the red behind it. the Iceland flag, blue background with a red cross with a white border. The Swedish flag, the yellow cross on blue. The Finnish flag, the blue cross on white. And many people don't think of the United Kingdom as a Viking country, but they are. And you can see the cross, in fact several crosses, the St. Andrew's cross and the St. George's cross, making the Union Jack. The Vikings came in 1066 and conquered England finally, the descendants of Duke Rollo. And one of the first castles they built was the Tower of London, the White Tower, which today is one of the most famous symbols of Great Britain. The Tower of London is where so many of the martyrs of the Reformation were locked up at some stage. The Celtic crosses of the poor victims of the Vikings and the towers which were built as a symbol very much of Ireland. They built those towers that they could flee into when the Vikings came, and they'd let them burn everything else around, but at least the people would be safe in these stone towers if they could just hold those. You can go to Minnesota today and you'll see statues to the Vikings because the Minnesotans come from Scandinavia. This is the Viking world, and this is some of how the Vikings came to Christ. This is an old film of Hollywood over 50 years ago on the Vikings, a lot more attempted accuracy than the present nonsense that they've tried to bring. I've in fact got articles on my website on the inaccuracies in the History Channel, or should we call it the Fiction Channel's Vikings. So, any questions, any comments on winning the Vikings to Christ? Thank you. Any people here descended from Vikings? Any Vikings in your ancestry? I know the original Hammonds were Hammer of Thor. Our people were some of those who tormented the English, raiding them. So my ancestors originally were Vikings too, from my father's side. Many of the Irish, of course, especially the red hair. If you have red hair, they say it almost certainly comes from the Vikings. Yes.
Did they just hold on to Christ, or did they actually believe?
Well, I'm sure there was a bit of both. Some of the people came to Christ out of fear. So you could say the Vikings came to fear God. But there was some genuine faith because you can see the fruit of it. You can see how the Vikings stopped being violent, stopped attacking their neighbors, start sending out missionaries instead of raids. So you can see the fruit. There's no doubt that Scandinavia today is still a mission field. And yet there's still missionaries being sent out from Norway and from Denmark and Sweden. Sweden, in fact, sends a lot of missionaries out. But they need missionaries as well. So there's still evidence of faith, and yet you can see there's been tremendous decay in the last century, so there needs to be a resurgence of it. But I would say you can certainly see from the flags alone and the ending of the Viking raids testifies to the fact a great work of grace was done. Let's pray. Lord God, we want to thank and praise you for this testimony from history of the power of the gospel. We thank you, Lord God, that the gospel is the power of Christ for the salvation of everyone who believes. In Jesus' name, amen.